Here we are. Federalism Notes, Unit 3. What we're starting off with is a little background and a little review of what we talked about before, and that specifically is the principles of government that we talked about with Unit 2 and the division of power. We talked about the separation into branches, and we talked about federalism, and now we need to understand how that division of power between the two levels of government, national and state, can be understood, and that we can do that by understanding the three branches at national and then comparing them to the three branches at the state level. When we look at that, again, as a review, why were they so afraid and what were they so afraid of? Why did they keep dividing the power up and up into all these different areas? Well, the idea was that they were afraid of the power being centralized, having tyranny, and all the reasons they fought the American Revolution. When we look at that division of power into the different levels, we need to think back about Article 6 and its supremacy clause that the national government would be above the states. The states are not powerless, though. Anything not given to the national government, we remember in Amendment 10 says is reserved for the states. And I realize you're looking at this going, wait, why is there local here? He keeps saying national, state, national, state, national, state. We'll look at the local government as the creation of it is determined by each state, but it is the smallest and closest to the people of the three levels. So within the national government, if we're going to determine the three branches and look at them, we also need to understand that if I say federal or I say national, it means the same thing. The federal government is divided into three branches. So is our state government. The national government has express powers like declaring war, create money. All of these things are only for the federal levels. Let's look a little bit more specifically at each of the branches here, and then when we look at the state governments, we're going to attempt to compare that to our national. So the first thing within this is the legislative branch, and that's made up of Congress. Congress's job is to make laws, and it's divided into two parts, the Senate and the House. The House is considered the lower part of Congress, whereas the Senate is the upper part. The Senate has a little bit more to deal with the president. They're not elected as frequently with a 6-year term, and they don't have some of the restrictions that you see in the House of Representatives. With a smaller group of people, they're allowed to talk for an unlimited amount of time on bills, which is called a filibuster, where a senator attempts to talk until the people who sponsored a bill remove it and say that they have better things to do. You don't see that in the House of Representatives, but what you do see is the creation of any bill dealing with the raising of money to pay for a program, and that's called an appropriation bill. They also, in the House of Representatives, start any impeachment proceeding that may happen, whereas the Senate would be the jury in that case. And in an impeachment proceedings, the Senate would have to vote with a 2/3 or 3/5 majority. In the House of Representatives, you guys are all represented by Patrick McHenry, and within the Senate is 2 per state, and they represent the entire state, so you're represented as well as every North Carolinian by Tom Tillis and Richard Burr. The House of Representatives, though, is about districts. We have 13 districts within the state of North Carolina, and those districts are drawn by the state as one of their reserved powers. The way that they draw the districts, though, it can be confusing, and it leads to a term called gerrymandering. And gerrymandering is when you draw the districts in a way that benefits or limits the power of a particular group of people. And so currently North Carolina, as well as several other states, are dealing with this problem where in 2010, on the last census, which is a population count, they redrew the districts, which all have to be about the same number of people, but they were drawn in a way that would benefit one group of people. In 2010, 12. You'll note that the state of North Carolina voted for a Democrat for president, and yet 10 of the 13 districts voted for a Republican. That should seem odd to you. By redrawing the districts in a different way, it was possible to make 9 of the 13 districts vote Democrat. And there's also a way to draw it where it would split 5 and 5 with 3 that are too close to call without the vote actually happening. They use this based on past voting records for districts and precincts in counties, and so they use that to determine which way they think people will vote. And that's how you end up with a gerrymandered district map like this. This has since changed in the state of North Carolina, and we'll look at that due to a federal court case. And we'll look at that a little bit more specifically and how that happened. Then we move over to the executive branch. Here's your executive branch information. The executive branch is headed by the president and all the people that help him enforce the laws. About 3 million, give or take, make up the federal bureaucracy. The president and vice president are at the top of that. Their job, president's job, is to lead these groups in enforcing the laws, and the requirements are as follows. The people that are directly working for the president are called his cabinet, and they're his advisors in a bunch of key areas. Those advisors are made up of the heads of the 15 executive departments. Each of those executive departments is led by a person called the secretary of, and then whatever department that is. Like Betsy DeVos is the secretary of education. She's the head of the education department, and she's a member of the cabinet. The only exception to that named secretary of is the attorney general, who is the Department of Justice head. In addition to that, you have a number of executive agencies. They're independent agencies that are not directly executive linked. They operate independent, and then they report their findings to the president. Several of them sit in cabinet meetings as well. And in the executive agencies, you'll see things like the Environmental Protection Agency, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, things like that. And then the last part of the federal bureaucracy is several of the government corporations. Most notably in this is like the mail is run by a government corporation. They run in a way that is not for profit. So the Federal Postage Service is run in a government corporation. They don't try to make money. They just try to break even at the end of the day. The federal court system, the last part of the judicial branch, is made up of 3 levels, with the Supreme Court being at the top, 9 justices there. Their job is to have ultimate say. Anything that they say is the final word of the law. No other courts or rulings below them will have power over them. They have ultimate say on that. Below them are the U.S. appeals courts. There's 12 of those, as well as the 13th to deal with a special area, but it doesn't really have a district. And their job in the appeals court is specifically to review the decisions made within the lower court cases if there was some improper ethical problem. And U.S. district courts are the base level. They have jury trials. They deal with things that are the facts of the case. And most of the time when you think of courtroom, you think of how a U.S. district court looks, with a single judge and a jury and bailiff and the opposing counsels presenting witnesses and evidence. And you only really see that here at the district court. That doesn't apply in the appeals or Supreme Court. The terms I really need you to know here are original or appellate jurisdiction. Original jurisdiction is the ability of a court to hear and determine facts within, gather evidence, and will judge on the defendant or plaintiff prosecution with words like guilty or not guilty. The U.S. District Court has that, and the U.S. Supreme Court has that in very rare situations, but it does have some original jurisdiction. Things that involve a foreign country would happen, or cases between 2 states. whereas appellate jurisdiction is the ability of a court to look at a previous court's decision and rule on that decision. So they're not going to say someone's guilty. They're going to say we uphold or we overturn that decision, or they can even remand a decision, which means we just need the whole case to start all over again. The U.S. appeals courts in the United States are divided into these 12 areas, and you'll notice we are in Area 4. The U.S. districts within North Carolina, we have 3 of them, and we have 3 federal district courts. One's in Statesville, one is in Charlotte, and the other one is in Asheville. All right, so now that we've looked at the 3 branches within the national government, let's try and compare that to the state government's version of the same thing. The state government here in the Tar Heel State, we have reserved powers like running elections or determining voting districts. We saw that with the gerrymandering. The state General Assembly, which is our legislative branch, gets to determine what our voting districts are for our House of Representatives, Congress members. They also set up the local governments, and that's where our third level, lowest level comes from. So if we look at our General Assembly, which is our legislative branch, we'll notice it is similar in structure to U.S. Congress. It has 2 parts. They're called the House and Senate, but the requirements to be in the General Assembly are much lower. 21 years old for a House member, 25 for a senator. There's much smaller, 120 instead of 435 or 50 instead of 100. In Gastonia, you guys are represented by Gaston County is represented in the NC Senate is Kathy Harrington. And depending on where you live, if you're closer to Bessemer City or Chapel Grove, you're Kelly Hastings. If you're in city area, you're represented by Dana Baumgartner. There may be a few people who are represented by Tim Moore if you're a Kings Mountain address. And that really depends on where you live. With 120 districts, it's split up a lot smaller. But they are, the House and Senate, for all intents and purposes, set up the same and organized the same way as Congress is. Okay. That's the legislative branch. Let's look at the executive branch. The executive branch in North Carolina is made up of 2 people at the top, the governor and then his lieutenant governor. The governor and lieutenant governor, though, unlike the president and vice president who get elected together, the governor and lieutenant governor are elected separately. So we have Roy Cooper as a governor. He's a Democrat, and he was elected separately of Dan Forest, who is our lieutenant governor, who is a Republican. This doesn't happen frequently, but it is possible because of the way they are elected. They are assisted by a council of state. A number of the council of state within North Carolina are elected directly from the people. Popular sovereignty is a big deal here, and the governor has the ability to appoint some other advisors in his cabinet. The rest of the executive branch is made up of executive departments, much like what we see in the federal government and executive agencies. But instead of government corporations, we see licensing boards within the state, as that is a major problem for the state and major powers that they have. When we switch over to the state judicial system, you'll notice the major difference is at the bottom. The major difference at the bottom is that there are 2 sets of trial courts, and within this level, there is no original jurisdiction for the North Carolina Supreme Court. All original jurisdiction and trial courts trials happen in North Carolina District or North Carolina Superior Courts. District courts normally deal with minor issues, traffic courts, misdemeanors, whereas Superior Courts deal with felonies, major cases, civil cases above $25,000. And then those are heard from the U.S. Appeals Courts, and then finally the North Carolina Appeals Courts, and then finally the North Carolina Supreme Court. When we go past that and we look back, we see, those were pretty similar. They had the same breakdown, but we don't see that quite the same with local government. There is no judicial branch for the local government. Instead, we see just legislative and executive, and then the judicial branch in local areas like our county is part of the state judicial system. Above the green line on both of these, we see our county government leads. So the legislative branch for the county is the county commissioners. The legislative branch for, the executive branch for the county is the county sheriff. And then below that, we see it for the city. The legislative branch for the city is the Gastonia City Council and the Gastonia City Mayor. The other thing that I want to point out here, and it's not in this, but I do want to kind of say something, is that there's another part of local government that applies to you, and that is our Gaston County School Board. Gaston County School Board is elected by people of Gaston County. It is a form of government. They do represent you in all things dealing with the school. Well, that's the Unit 3 notes. Why don't we just finish off with a little pun or joke for the day? Which species of fish are the most democratic? Well, those are the ones that vote in elections. No? All right. That's the end of the notes. Mr. Husky, sign off.